Chapter 2. The Colonies Mature. Part 4. Colonial Society in the 1700s. Section 1. Southern culture continues to pursue its aristocratic dream. In the American South, the passing of time merely fortified the feudal-like distinction between the firmly established Southern gentry, which increasingly took on the appearance and behavior of English aristocracy, and the poor white dirt farmers living precariously along the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains that rose abruptly to the west of the open, fertile fields of Tidewater, Virginia, and Maryland. A classic example of the Southern gentleman, William Byrd II. The Virginian, William Byrd II, exemplified the aristocratic nature of those who dominated Virginian life during these formative years of the colony. William II was born in 1674 on his father William I's huge Belvedere estate, later known as the Westover Plantation, near the modern site of Richmond, further up the James River from Jamestown. As was typical of the Virginian nobility, the young William was sent off to England at age 7 for schooling while living with relatives there. Here, for 9 years, he studied classic and modern European languages and literature. He then apprenticed in London and Rotterdam in the tobacco trade before taking up the study of law at the Middle Temple, London, in 1692. He was admitted to the bar in 1695 and, compliments of the support of family friend Sir Robert Southwell, was elected to the Royal Society in 1696. In also 1696, he returned to his native Virginia, which he had not seen in 17 years. Here, with his aristocratic father's urging and backing, William was elected to the House of Burgesses, representing Henrico County. But finding colonial life lacking the sparkle of English social life, William soon resigned his position and returned to England to practice law. In 1698, he received the appointment as London agent of the Virginia's Governor Council, that is, the upper chamber of the House of Burgesses, thus now entitled to the prestigious title of Colonel. However, in this position, he became deeply involved in political tensions arising between his father and Virginia Governor Nicholson, for the Byrds had been supporters of the ousted former governor Sir Edmund Andros. His 4 years at this position made him a somewhat cynical observer of political behavior. Also, this aspiring young colonel found that, despite all of his close study and discipline in the graces of the English aristocracy, he suffered from the incurable social disease of being a mere colonial, and was never accepted into English society on an equal footing, despite his many social accomplishments. Thus, in hearing of his father's death in 1705, he returned to Virginia to take up the responsibilities of running the huge estate he just inherited. Those responsibilities included not only supervising the vast production of tobacco by hundreds of slaves, but of representing the Westover Plantation in all its power and social grace to the Society of Virginia aristocracy. In this he was well prepared, compliments of his years of unsuccessful effort in London to achieve entrance into English aristocracy. In 1709, he was appointed to the Governor's Council, seated in the Virginia capital of Williamsburg. He found a wife from Colonial Society, daughter of Colonel Daniel Parke II, governor of the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean, Lucy Parke. This high-spirited young lady was a perfect social match for William. Though not untypical of high society at the time, William was reputed to have having alliances with a number of other women during their 10-year marriage. In 1715, Lucy died of smallpox. William would remarry 8 years later, and from this second marriage, William III would be born. This Virginia taskmaster could be tough on his slaves. The beating of slaves for even minor infractions was normal procedure, but also on himself. He rode hard, ventured into the Virginia wilderness to survey the boundary line between Virginia and North Carolina, founded the town of Richmond, and kept himself well read on all the latest literature, which he added to his classic collection, around 4,000 books in his personal library, which he considered to be nearly sacred ground. He even took up writing book-length studies, most notably his adventures during the North Carolina-Virginia surveying expedition. When he died in 1744, he left to his son William III family land holdings which at this point totaled almost 180,000 acres. Section 2, Georgia, the last of the original 13 colonies, the founding of the Georgia colony. The last of the American colonies, Georgia, chartered by King George in 1732, was quite different in conception from the others. It was not conceived originally as either a place of religious refuge or as a money-making venture, though certainly it was hoped that the Georgia colony would be able to cover its expenses. It was primarily a military colony, with the additional idea in mind that it could be a place to resettle England's poor, languishing in England's prisons because of debt. The main inspiration for the colony came from English General James Oglethorpe, who had been involved in the War of Spanish Succession of 1701-1713. Although the question of which family should rule Spain had been resolved back in Europe, other questions, including the issue of what exactly were Spain's rights in North America, were still open. Trouble from Spanish Florida was expected. Thus, a fortified colony south of Charleston and north of Florida was seen as a military necessity. Oglethorpe, as a member of Parliament, had been involved in a study of the conditions in England's debtors' prisons, which he found appalling and little likely to improve the lot of a debtor. So, the idea emerged of using this proposed military colony as a place to help debtors get out from under an impossible situation. Oglethorpe and a group of fellow philanthropists thus petitioned King George for just such a colony in 1732. The plans were to build forts along the coast of this new colony of Georgia and to locate the colony's capital city, also constructed in a very well laid out grid pattern, at the mouth of the Savannah River. Blacks and Catholics were excluded from the colony, at least during its very first years, in the hope of ensuring against any dangers of religious and racial turmoil. Actually, very few debtors made their way to the colony, but it soon became a place of refuge for religious minorities from the continent of Europe and for English tradesmen hoping for a better start in life. Still, the tight supervisory mindset that was supposed to get the colony off in the right direction seemed to serve to discourage a great number of settlers from coming to Georgia. Most new settlers preferred to head instead to the less restrictive Carolinas. Only after the various laws regulating the character and behavior of the settlers were lifted did the colony begin to receive a large number of settlers. Then, by 1750, the colony began to take on the cultural flavor of nearby South Carolina and the capital city, Savannah, some of the character of Charleston. Section 3. The Great Awakening suddenly and mysteriously restores the Christian spirit in the colonies. Footnote. The term Great Awakening was first applied to this event with the publication in 1842 of Joseph Tracy's book, The Great Awakening. End of footnote. Around 1740, just as it appeared that Christian foundations of early America were about to die out for a lack of spiritual interest or even cultural support, something mysterious infected the American heart. The Great Awakening suddenly broke out upon the American scene to restore the warmth of America's affection for God and Jesus, and the belief once again in God's total sovereignty in America. This involved a full-scale religious revival, drawing thousands of Americans who gathered in open fields to hear evangelists call them back to the old-time religion that their Puritan ancestors had known Christianity to be. Some gatherings, for instance, drew thousands of ordinary Americans, not only rekindling the American sense of being a covenant people, but in the process revitalizing the American sense of the basic equality of all people. Because, according to these revivalist preachers, in the eyes of God, all people were equal. Frelinghuysen and the Tenants. Actually, something of the strong revivalist nature started some 10 years earlier, the period of 1725, 1726, just here and there in New England and in the middle colonies. Theodore Frelinghuysen had been given the task of pastoring a number of small Dutch Reformed churches in the Raritan Valley of New Jersey. He understood his central responsibility was to bring the wandering Christian souls back in line with a faith rather than works approach to their Christian life. He issued a strong call to the faithful for repentance and a return to God as the guiding force in their lives. This was a challenge to take up something much more rigorous than just regular church attendance and proper Christian moral behavior. This was a call to deep renewal of the people's faith in God personally as director of their lives. Something of the same nature was going on at about the same time in nearby central New Jersey. William Tennant and his sons, particularly Gilbert, found themselves deeply committed to issuing to the Presbyterian congregations of the area a similar evangelical call to spiritual repentance and revival of their Christian faith. Jonathan Edwards. Likewise in New England, elements of a similar spiritual revival were begun during the mid-1730s by Jonathan Edwards at his quite large Congregationalist church in Northampton, Massachusetts. There was a deep earnestness on Edwards' part concerning the sinfulness of the faithful and the need for repentance, which stirred the emotions deeply of his congregation. Some 300 people were brought into fellowship with Edwards' congregation during that period. But all the emotionalism of such Christian revivals began to stir the ire of some of the other pastors of New England and middle colonies, and briefly it appeared that the whole thing would soon die away anyway. George Whitefield. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in England, something of the same nature was taking place, led principally by the English Calvinist reformer George Whitefield and his close friends, the Anglican reformers John and Charles Wesley. Footnote, or Methodists, as they were termed contemptuously by their peers at the time because of the spiritual disciplines they put themselves under in order to strengthen their faith and support their work. End of footnote. They developed in their close relationship, despite some theological differences, during their years at Oxford University, where they created and led the Holy Club, before, at different points in time, heading off to the colony of Georgia for a couple of years as pastors. On their return to England, after rather inspiring efforts in Georgia, the spirit of revival rather dramatically reshaped their ministries. In 1739, taking at first Whitefield and then John Wesley out into open fields among the working classes to preach the message of salvation. Such open-air preaching was a dramatic departure from the type of pulpit preaching expected of pastors, but while irritating some of the Christian faithful, succeeded in reaching thousands of people who otherwise would have never found themselves inside of a church except for weddings and funerals. Something new was happening here. Footnote. While Whitefield was busy developing Christian revival in America, his friend John Wesley was busy doing the same in England, thus founding there what was to become the Methodist movement. Eventually, 1760 and after, Wesley's Methodist movement would come to America, still considering itself an integral part of the Church of England and under its discipline. But in 1784, with America's break from England following its War of Independence, the Wesleyan or Methodist movement in America would reform itself as the Methodist Episcopal Church, coming under its own bishops, Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. At this point, the Methodist Church would truly take off as a massive revival movement, especially as a result of the extensive work of the Methodist circuit riders, who carried the spirit of revival to the rapidly expanding American frontier. In 1740, Whitefield returned to Georgia to found an orphanage, and then moved on to Pennsylvania to do the same there, in partnership with Moravians, preaching every day as he made his way across the colonies. Gradually, word began to spread among the colonies about this revivalist preacher, Whitefield, who was at first invited, as was the custom, to preach in various churches along the way. Meanwhile, Tennant and Edwards linked up with Whitefield, inviting Whitefield to New Jersey and New England to preach there. With this, full revival began to break out, not just in Northampton nor central New Jersey, but at various places throughout the colonies, as Whitefield now preached his way from New England in the north to Georgia in the south. Thus, Whitefield found that his mission was no longer orphanages, but simply a continuation of his preaching, wherever the Spirit directed his path. But having found it also easy in England to preach in open-air settings, fields and town squares, he proceeded to do the same in America. For some, this was quite a bit too much, and now he found some church doors closing on him. But he continued to preach open-air style anyway. Edwards' calm style helps extend the Great Awakening. Edwards himself became a major figure in the broader revival, with his preaching in 1741 in his church, and again in Connecticut, his famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Although Edwards did not take up the fiery style of Whitefield, his calmly presented sermons had much the same effect on his listeners: repentance and the call to salvation. The impact of the Great Awakening. The effect of this revivalist preaching was overwhelming. Revival swept like a whirlwind everywhere throughout the colonies, especially in the years 1741 to 1743. This first truly all-American event went far not only in restoring a deep spirituality in America, but also giving the colonists from the north to the south a sense of being a unique people, something akin to a nation. Americans now had national heroes as Americans, revivalists and missionaries well known up and down the colonies as part of the common experience of American life. Whitefield became very well known from Maine to Georgia, moving up and down the American colonies over the course of the 32-year period, 1738 to 1770, when he visited America numerous times to preach revival. Also, the heroic story of the young Presbyterian missionary and friend of Edwards, David Brainerd, who wore himself out, that is with tuberculosis, preaching a similar revival to the Indians, was well known across the colonies, making him something of a national hero. And the Presbyterian minister Samuel Davies became a powerful instrument in reaching African slaves in Virginia with the gospel message. Furthermore, the sermons of revivalist preachers, especially Edwards' sermons, were read widely throughout the colonies. Footnote: faithful narratives of the surprising work of God and the conversion of many hundred souls in Northampton, 1737. The distinguishing marks of a work of the Spirit of God, 1741. Some thoughts concerning religious affections, 1742, among his many other publications. All of this worked to build a collective national spirit and a collective identity of the colonists as Americans. Opposition to the new style. Not every American got swept up in this awakening. There were many hostile critics among the American intellectuals who found this phenomenon most improper. Unfortunately, the excitement of the new style led some enthusiastic pastors to go overboard in that enthusiasm. For instance, James Davenport went all out, not only in viciously attacking people who had not embraced fully the revival, but going through strange emotional highs himself publicly, possibly suffering from bouts of insanity in the service of his cause, which made it very easy to be quite critical of the excessive enthusiasm of that cause. Indeed, for many of the old light Christians led by Boston pastor Charles Chauncey, revivalist preaching emotionally charged sermons in open fields before thousands of common farmers and tradesmen and women, rather than to parishioners properly attired in their Sunday finery and seated properly in their pews in the church, attentive to the theological details of a scholarly sermon, that was just not proper Christianity. Worse, such proper church-going Christians being called out by revivalists as sinners needing the forgiveness of God, no less than the sinners of the inferior social ranks, was considered by those proper Christians as an outrageous idea. Then, too, many pastors simply bitterly jealous that while their churches remained empty, hundreds, even thousands of people found it easy enough to gather in nearby fields to hear the preachers of spiritual revival. But these critics were a small voice, actually, in the scheme of things. Ben Franklin's take on the matter. Even the greatest American sage of the time, Ben Franklin, found himself warmed, at least intellectually, by this massive religious revival. In fact, he personally saw to the publishing of many, 40 or more, of Whitfield's sermons on the front page of his newspaper, the Gazette. Indeed, the two of them, Franklin and Whitfield, formed a deep friendship that lasted the entire span of Whitfield's remaining life. He died in 1770. God knew that the Americans would need this preparation for the days ahead, when troubles would mount between the Americans and the powers of Europe, and also the native Indians. Americans were going to need a strong faith in God's deliverance to survive these troubles, and thus the Great Awakening was well timed to bring exactly such spiritual preparation. God was being faithful to keep his side of the covenant with America.